Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane, and today I'm very excited to walk you through how to frame a mini quilt. We'll be taking fabric scraps and turning them into a mini quilt, perfect for framing. This allows you to take a quilt and display it as artwork in your home. Framing a mini quilt is a fantastic way to showcase your creativity and personality in a small project, and I also love it because smaller quilting projects like this are a great opportunity to try out a new skill or technique, or maybe just try something fun and new. I'll get started by sharing what supplies you'll need to follow along with this tutorial. So first off, you'll need lots of fabric scraps. You'll see the design that I'm choosing to do. I used AccuQuilt to cut out some smaller pieces, but the beautiful thing about a framed mini quilt is that you can do lots of different techniques for piecing your mini quilt. It could be patchwork, it could be applique, maybe you want to do some improv piecing, but either way, what you'll need is a bunch of fabric scraps. Next, you'll also need a frame. The one I'm showing you in this tutorial is an 11 by 14 inch frame, but you'll really want to measure the actual frame because, as I found out, it's actually 10 3/4 by 13 3/4. So if you wanted your quilt to go all the way to the edges of the frame, that's super important. Also, you can use a frame with a mat along the insides. This one is just the frame, so I want mine to go all the way to the edges like I did in this example. You can see the quilt matches up perfectly with the sides, and all I did here was just add some borders so that I could trim it down to size, and I'll show you that step in a bit. Other supplies you'll need: batting. It's optional, but I do recommend it because I like the added texture that you can add to it when you quilt it. This is just a scrap of batting that I had. It happens to be fusible. So this fusible batting is nice because I can iron it onto my mini quilt, but you don't need that. You can use any kind of batting scraps that you might have. And then finally, basic sewing supplies. If you need a refresher on what essential tools you need for quilting, I'll go ahead and link a tutorial here for you. I've got my pins, my thread. I'm using silk finish cotton thread. This is one of my go-to favorites for piecing and quilting. It's 50 weight cotton thread by Mettler. So once you have all of your supplies, we'll go ahead and dive in and get started making our mini quilt. The mini quilt that I'll be making in this tutorial is just a simple patchwork mini quilt featuring some traditional shapes that you might recognize. I made a bunch of flying geese and I designed it myself. You can design your own mini patchwork quilt using graph paper or any other tools that you might be familiar with already. I personally use a graphic design software for mine, but then again, I am a pattern designer. So I will invite you to make it your own. If you want to do patchwork, I'll share some of the specifics of my patchwork quilt with you. But because you can do a framed mini quilt in any size frame, you can make your mini quilt any size that you want it. Some techniques that you might consider trying, if you don't want to do patchwork like mine, you might consider applique, which would be if you take one piece of fabric and then sew pieces on top of it. Or you might even try improv quilting as well, which can be really fun to use up some scraps and not have to do a lot of math or think about it. Because my frame is 11 by 14, and as I mentioned, it's actually a 1/4 inch smaller on both sides, I needed to do lots of planning to make sure that my mini quilt would fit the frame exactly. If you're doing a frame with a mat, you don't have to be quite as exact, but it is helpful. So I knew I needed to do some advanced planning, and I designed a quilt that would be slightly smaller than the frame, and then I'm just adding borders to the sides, and then I'll trim down later. So let me show you the mini quilt that I've designed and where I'm at in the process. So you'll see here, I've got the blocks that I've been working on. I started out by making 8 flying geese. So these are each 2 inches by 4 inch finished flying geese. And then I also cut out a few background pieces. I cut out 2 of these, technically 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles, and then one 4.5 by 4.5 inch square of background fabric. And when I sew all of these together, I'll end up with something that is roughly 8 inches by 12 inches. I'll also add these 8.5 inch strips to the top and the bottom to make it a little bit bigger than I need. And then I have some 14.5-inch strips to add to the sides. So I'll go ahead and piece all of these together for my mini quilt, and you can go ahead and follow along if you wanted to make the same exact one as I did, or maybe just try something completely brand new, following what I shared earlier about the different techniques you could try out. If you are using a different size frame, you're welcome to just make bigger borders. You can always just make them bigger than you think that you'll need them and then trim down. Or you could always add more shapes or do bigger blocks for your quilt too. If you're following along with my version, I went ahead and made the blocks first, and then I sewed the blocks into rows, and then I'll go ahead and pin the rows together, and then we'll add the sides. If you want to make a patchwork mini quilt very similar to mine using all of the same dimensions, head over to the link in the description below, or I'll post it right here for you, to find the written article tutorial walking through how to make a framed mini quilt, and I'll share the exact dimensions of all of the pieces that I used. And then you can go ahead and make your blocks, sew the blocks together. I sew them first into square blocks, and then I sew those blocks into rows, and then I just add the borders. So very simple. You can do it that way or find a different way if you prefer. Once your quilt top is pieced, you have one of two options. You can go ahead and start getting ready to frame it as it is, as just a pieced quilt top, or you can add your scrap of batting and add some decorative stitching to quilt the batting and the quilt top together. That just adds a little bit of fun texture to it. This is another great opportunity to play around with something new. Maybe you want to try hand quilting little bits and pieces. Maybe you want to do some fun pops of color in your thread decisions, maybe some bold thread, or maybe you want to try free motion quilting, or if you haven't tried straight line quilting, this is a great opportunity to play around with it. So I'm going to go ahead and baste my quilt top onto my batting scrap. And when it comes to picking out your batting, any kind of batting will do. Any scraps that you already have on hand are perfect. I'm just gonna go ahead, as I mentioned earlier, mine is a fusible batting, so I'm gonna iron them together and then they'll hold tight. You don't necessarily need fusible. You can do a little bit of, just a little bit of spray based to attach the layers together, or if you have safety pins or even regular pins on a project this size, just anything to keep the batting and the quilt top as one unit so that they're not shifting around while you're quilting. So once you've basted your quilt top together, you're ready to quilt it. You can choose whatever method is really speaking to you. It's your art, it's your creativity. I don't even have a plan for mine yet. I'm just gonna sit down at my machine and do some stitching. We'll see what happens. So next, once you've added all the quilting that you want, I just added a little bit here for the purposes of this tutorial. You can go ahead and grab a ruler and your rotary cutter, and we're gonna trim it down to size. So because I mentioned earlier my frames don't have any matting, I want to be very exact with the way that I trim. So I need it to be 10 3/4 by 13 3/4 inches. So I grabbed my nice big ruler here. So 10 3/4 by 13 3/4. So roughly here. And because it's an abstract quilt, I really don't need it to be centered, but I do want it to be square. So I'll line up the ruler and then I'll grab my rotary cutter. And then I rotate it and I do the opposite side this time, really lining up that 10 3/4 by the 13 3/4, finding that little dot right there, and then trim the final 2 sides. So once your mini quilt is trimmed, I do recommend adding some more quilting, just stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge around all 4 edges before we put the mini quilt in the frame. And now we're ready for the easy part. We basically just have to put our mini quilt inside the frame. So we've made sure that the quilt is the right size. We've got our frame. Most frames work exactly the same way. They have a bunch of little brackets on the back, I guess, that you can slide over. Your frame might be different, so just open up your frame. Pay attention to the top, because your quilt, although this doesn't technically have a top and a bottom, I want this to be at the top. You can take the back piece out, take out that stock image, and then for this one, because it's a brand new frame, I do have some pieces of film to peel off the glass. So then we put the glass back into our frame. This is not actual glass, it's plastic, but whatever it is in your frame. And then you'll put the quilt down, centering it. Especially if you have the matting, you might need to flip back and forth a little bit, make sure it's nice and centered. And then go ahead and take that back and place it back inside the frame. Easy peasy. It should slide right in. And then we'll use the brackets to close the frame up again. And then you can flip it over and check out your beautiful brand new piece of artwork. The final step here is just to hang your quilts wherever you see fit in your home. I personally made both of these for our upcoming baby room, so I'm very excited to hang these up for our nursery. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and useful, and I really hope it gives you the opportunity to try out a new skill or technique that maybe you haven't tried out before. It's a very small project with very low risk, so I really recommend grabbing some scraps and just getting started, letting your creativity take you wherever it may go. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up below, and of course subscribe to my YouTube channel. That really helps. It'll make sure that you see my future videos, and it also signals to other people like you that this video is a good one, that they should watch it too, so it really helps them too. Make sure to check out homadeemilyjane.com for lots more quilting tips, tricks, and tutorials just like this one. Happy sewing!